Inescapable. Shifters Forever, World's Book 20, by L. Thorne.
Chapter 1. Étienne tiptoed through the darkness, stopping to calm one of the dogs that hung around the slave cabins of Arceneaux plantation. He petted the dog's head and prayed the others would stay quiet for him this time, like they had all the other times. He was quiet, because there'd be hell to pay if he were caught again where he shouldn't be. Étienne was no child with a curfew. No, not at all. Étienne was trapped in slavery. Trapped, though he was the son of the plantation owner's son. And yet his birth, and even his very life, had been kept a secret. His toe hooked on a rebellious tree root, but he regained his step before catapulting and thrown into a headlong fall. A fall wouldn't be a good thing. Not only because he'd get caught and feel the lash of the whip on his shoulders, his flesh hadn't healed from the last time 3 days ago. No, not just the excruciating touch of the whip, but also the possibility he'd lose the precious cargo he was carrying tonight. Cargo in the form of honey he was taking to his grandmother, who lived in one of the cabins. Étienne stayed in the quarters with the other single men closer to the main house, though many nights he wished he were still in his grandmother's cabin. That would never happen. The overseer had a special brand of hatred for Étienne. Maybe it was because his skin was so light. Maybe it was because his heritage was whispered about, if not confirmed. Or maybe it was plain old meanness, as others often said. The night was dark, the moon barely a sliver, with sounds of the nightlife that surrounded the swampy lands outside the city of New Orleans. Just a few more yards. He stuck close to the trees and cabins, staying in the shadows, his senses on high alert for watchful eyes that could bring hell to him tomorrow morning. If I'm caught. Yes, if he were caught. Which he'd do his damnedest not to be. Finally, he was in front of Nana's door. He raised his hand to scratch on the wood lightly, to make no more noise than a rodent. The door opened before he could touch it. Nana's beautiful dark face, eyes wide, peered into the darkness. She always opened the door, as if she knew he would be there. As if expecting him. Every time. Recognition shone in her eyes. They narrowed as she smiled, teeth emerging in a broad grin. Étienne. Her voice was a mere whisper, not rising above the din of crickets and toads. Étienne nodded, and held up a tiny container. The viscous amber liquid glowed in the candlelight shining behind Nana. She reached through the crack, a tiny hand on an arm that was thinner than Étienne would have wanted, and she pulled him inside with a strength that belied her age and size. Come. She closed the door behind him softly, then whirled on him, arms wrapping around Étienne's waist. What did you do to get that? She raised her eyes to his. It was then he noticed the white hairs coursing through her dark ones at her temples. It pained Étienne to see his grandmother with signs of age, and the signs grew more and more prevalent with every visit he paid her. Truth was, Nana, known to everyone else as Marguerite, was more than his grandmother. Nana had raised him from birth. Étienne squeezed her shoulders, not too tightly, bearing in mind her frailty, then placed the prize cargo into her palm. You'll stay. Let me get you something warm to drink. She winked at him, conspiratorially. I have tea grounds. And how did you get those? Étienne smiled at the sheer joy on her face. I have my ways. And the hot water is ready. The hot water always was ready. Nana kept water heating all hours of the day. She never knew when she'd be called on to make a poultice or boil herbs. Everyone came to Nana for healing. Moments later, Étienne was sitting at her table made of rummaged lumber, on a chair made of more rummaged lumber, his feet digging into the dirt floor. Nana put a biscuit before him, a layer of the honey he just brought slathered liberally on each half. No, Nana. You eat. Don't be silly. She showed him 2 more biscuits in a basket under a rag. Étienne took a bite, knowing it gave her pleasure to watch him eat. He followed the bite with a swallow of the hot tea. She'd put honey in there, too. Nana sat across from him. There's blood on your back. He winced. Not from the physical pain, but from Nana knowing what he'd been through. Too bad old Mr. Arceneaux doesn't know the ways of his new overseer. It's not like he really knew the ways of the old one, either. Étienne only shrugged, causing himself pain. But he resisted the urge to flinch when he moved forward. The lashes he'd taken the other day did more than smart. Étienne's mother had died in childbirth, and when asked, Nana had claimed to all that did not need to know that her newborn had died too. Nana raised Étienne as her own. She wouldn't have managed this if she hadn't been so trusted, and not kept under close watch. Old Mr. Arceneaux, as she called him, had a special fondness for her. The man who Étienne resembled, his father Philip, young Mr. Arceneaux, though no one would say so out loud, had left to go to college. His long-forgotten tryst with Étienne's mother had remained as such, forgotten. As well as the child they'd had. When Philip had come home for break, he'd asked about Étienne's mother, thinking maybe one day they could have something, move far away where the scourge of slavery did not taint their lives, but he was told she died. And he was never told about the son he'd fathered. Philip never came back to the plantation again. Étienne had no knowledge of what his father looked like, no idea of hair color, eye color, the sound of his voice, nothing. And if he were honest, at this stage in his life, he didn't care. It didn't matter to him that Philip Arceneaux didn't know he existed. What did matter was his mother died giving birth to him, and Philip Arceneaux wasn't even aware of it. I have to go before I'm caught here. Go. But Nana hesitated. Her fingers worked the rag in her hands, over and over, twisting the threadbare fabric. Étienne waited patiently for her to start again. After a deep breath, she did. I've been visited, Nana said. He knew what that meant. She'd had a visit from the Dark Visitor, the one that heralded death. It was said amongst the others that Nana had the gift. The Dark Visitor would tell her of a death. Who now? Étienne had humored Nana over the years, though to be truthful, he'd found her predictions had been mostly accurate. It was eerie, but he always pushed her gifts aside. Étienne wanted nothing to do with the preternatural or supernatural world. The idea of dark visitors made his skin crawl. My turn, Nana said. He shook his head. No. You're too young. And she was, in spirit, though at 80-something years, her body denied her the privilege of youth. He kissed her on the cheek. I'll stop by soon. If he could. If he could sneak away. If he wasn't shackled again. Why he irked the overseer more than any other on the plantation, Étienne had no idea, but he dealt with it. As best as a man who had no choice and no rights could.
Chapter 2. Latrice Mathieu, the dark-skinned High Witch of the Black Glade Coven, skulked around the wooded area behind the slave cabins of the Arceneaux plantation. Latrice was free. She had no master, and she belonged to no man. Too bad her mind wasn't as free. The man she'd found herself unable to free from her mind. Étienne. Étienne, the one who carried himself like a king, no matter what task he was about. Étienne, whose heritage was a hushed subject, though Latrice had her own suspicions. She watched Étienne sneak into Marguerite's cabin. She smelled the blood, knew it was his. Then when he'd slip out of the shadows, and allowed the sliver of a moon to illuminate him, she saw the dark stripes of dried blood along the back of his shirt. Latrice would see to that overseer. She'd see to him the way she saw to the last one. Étienne's days of suffering, the other's days of suffering, she'd put an end to that. Again. One spell, that's all it will take. The idea gave her comfort, knowing that though she couldn't do much, she could rid Arceneaux plantation of the abusive overseers. Latrice waited for a long time, while Étienne and his grandmother visited within her cabin. Their hushed tones were a soft murmur as Latrice parked herself beneath a live oak tree with a trunk thicker than two men put together. She waited, as she always did, for Étienne's visit to come to an end and to make sure he made it to his own quarters safely. For though she couldn't protect him from the overseer, there were things, beings, that roamed the nights in the bayou that could prove far more harmful to Étienne than the overseer. Beings that could drain him of his very essence, or if they were wont to, rip him to shreds before he knew he was under attack. For this she waited. Any night Étienne decided to venture on forays, for whatever reason, usually to visit his grandmother Marguerite. For this Latrice waited. For him. For the lives she knew he and she would both affect.
Chapter 3. Étienne was in the fields the next day, dawn to dusk, and when he returned he was shackled to a post, left in a lean-to. The overseer had heard he'd been out the night before. Heard or guessed. Étienne didn't know. All he knew was he was shackled. The metal cuffs jangled every time he moved, a reminder of his punishment. He stopped moving, so he wouldn't have to hear the sounds of his imprisonment. He sat in the dark. Alone. Cold. And he'd not had a chance to have a meal. Nothing. All day, none had talked to him, for fear of rousing Overseer Jasper's anger. Étienne shrugged in vain to make a buzzing mosquito leave him alone. He scratched against the post where the mosquito had dined, and raised a welt on his already mosquito-bitten flesh. A shuffling sound caught his attention. Étienne froze. "Your Nana is gone. The dark visitor she said had visited her has now claimed her," a voice whispered to him from outside. Étienne knew that voice. Old Ancestor. His grandmother's second or third cousin. "What? What did you say?" Silence followed. "It can't be. No. Not Nana." Étienne yelled. He raised his voice in a challenge to the very nature and all that any would hold holy. Étienne held nothing holy. He knew there was no holiness here. There was no light, no matter how much the sun shined. He yelled and yelled, until the sound of a branch hitting the lean-to's tin roof startled him. The overseer stood before him, silhouetted by the light of a torch carried by someone behind him. "Stop that yelling, or you'll taste old Reverend again." Yes, the overseer had named his whip. "My grandmother's dead. She's gone." Étienne paused to catch a breath, as yelling had left him without. Before he could continue, the overseer said, "So." Fury raged through Étienne. But he knew fury wouldn't serve him. No emotions would serve him now. "I'd like to be there when she's buried." Surely no decent being would deny him that. She was as much a mother as any mother could be. The overseer was no decent being. He laughed and stomped away. Étienne stayed silent. For more than an hour he grieved privately, shackled to the wooden beam, sitting on the dirt floor. A voice came out of the darkness again. Ancestor once more. She was buried. As twilight gathered darkness. "Without me. Ancestor, help me. Help is coming your way. In the still of the night, wait and be ready."
Chapter 4. Latrice was in the woods again, same as she was last night. But this time, Étienne wouldn't be escaping. He'd been shackled in the three-sided lean-to at the far edge of the grove that held the cabins. They buried Marguerite, while Étienne was shackled, and had no idea what was happening at the other end of the clearing. They opened the ground, placed Marguerite's coffin within, then piled dirt on top. Ancestor, a distant relative of Marguerite's, had said a few words, sung a song softly, his deep voice carrying the sorrow to Latrice. Then they'd all returned, heads low, each to their own abode. All had been there. All but Étienne, the one who should have been there. He'd be crushed. She knew much about this man because Latrice had watched him. Seen his rebellious ways, his strength, and the love he had for the grandmother who raised him. Latrice had cared for Étienne for as long as she could remember. Months ago she'd visited one of her cousins, a seer who told her about Étienne. She'd said it wasn't meant to be. That their lives would be intertwined forever, but he wasn't the one for her. Mystified, Latrice had left her cousin's place. Latrice had lost her mate, one of a neighboring coven's sorcerers. He'd been the first love of her life. But there was something different about Étienne, something about him that called to her. And there was something about him that pulled at her because their paths and their futures were intermingled.
Chapter 5. Achille told Étienne to be ready. And ready Étienne was. Sure enough, at the hour when no human wanted to be walking in the swampy, mosquito-infested, water-moccasin-crawling land near New Orleans, Étienne was released from his shackles with a key on a ring that surely belonged to the overseer. Étienne asked no questions and wanted no answers. Answers would be hard to keep secret under the overseer's whip. Though Étienne would wager on his ability to withstand the torment that could drive a lesser man to tell the source of the key, Étienne didn't want to tempt fate. Achille's expression was somber. Marguerite is in the graveyard, buried with her head to the west at the north end, under the large oak. A wooden marker with her name marks the spot. We'll do better by her later. Later? Who cares about later? Étienne nodded, not wanting Achille to read his expression and think he was anything but grateful. You? Nana appreciates, I am sure. Except Étienne wasn't sure. He wasn't sure what existed where, and did it matter if facing east, west, north, or south? Who knew if you really needed to be facing a certain direction when Gabriel blew his trumpet? Who knew if Gabriel really existed? Safe to say, Étienne no longer believed in anything good. And he was fine with his belief system. I'm going to visit Nana. Don't get caught, Achille muttered. After giving Achille another nod, Étienne headed toward the cemetery to see his grandmother's grave and pay his last respects. She'd been right. She'd received that visit from the dark visitor, and now she was gone. He approached Nana's grave, the fresh mound of dirt a different color than the older graves. A white luminescent object caught his attention. Étienne bent down to study it. It was a shell, a seashell Nana's grandfather had given to her grandmother long, long ago, when they'd been in a country far different than this one. The shell had made a long voyage and managed to be handed down, despite hardships and moves. A wave of melancholy floored Étienne momentarily. He swallowed down the knot of emotions.
Chapter 6. Latrice watched Étienne from the shadows, but a feeling of unease made her senses prickle. The tiny hairs at her nape raised. He bent down to study something on Marguerite's grave and seemed completely oblivious to his surroundings. Oblivious, until a peal of laughter filled the tiny cemetery. The sound was hollow and ethereal. And out from the shadows stepped an elegantly dressed man, his hair pulled back, his nails immaculate, his skin perfectly flawless and without pores. Vampire! Dread filled Latrice. Étienne's head flew up, his eyes widened, then narrowed as he studied the preternatural creature. He showed no fear, and yet no belief in the horrors this nightwalker could inflict upon him. Surely he wasn't so ignorant. Surely he knew. Surely. The vampire smiled, revealing fangs that glistened in the moonlight. Étienne's posture changed, as if now he realized what the creature was. Go away, Étienne hissed low, because clearly there was still the overseer to fear. Before Latrice could fully process the events, Étienne had taken off at a run, heading toward the bayou. Behind him, the vampire walked slowly as though enjoying a day in the park. Every few paces, the vampire would move at preternatural speed and close the distance between himself and Étienne. Latrice ran after them, at an angle as quietly as she could manage, steering clear of low branches and undergrowth obstacles. She heard a splash and picked up the pace to find a sight that made her heart seize as though a fist had been clenched around it. Étienne. In the vampire's arms. Limp. There at the bank's edge with the alligators, raccoons, and water moccasins as witnesses, the vampire was draining Étienne's blood. His long hair made a curtain blocking Latrice's view, but she didn't need to see to know what was happening. She couldn't sit back idly, simply couldn't. Standing to her full height, which wasn't much, she flung her hair behind her much the same way a warrior takes a stance in the midst of battle. She didn't need to make a sound, the vampire would feel her. She took a step closer, revealing herself and losing the cover of the shadows. The vampire lifted his head, his fangs exposed, a hiss coming from deep within his chest. His eyes rimmed in crimson, the whites dark from the feeding. Go. A tiny drop of blood lingered on the corner of his mouth. He's mine. Mine. Latrice lifted her hands, raising them to the moon as if in supplication. She clenched her jaw with the force of the power she was pulling in and pushing out toward the vampire. The power surged through Latrice, forging through her like a force of nature. It picked up all her powers, then jetted through her hands, lethal and invisible to human eyes, making a beeline for the vampire. The Nightwalker fell back from the power of the combined surge of her skills and the moon's energy. He caught his fall, dropping Étienne, who landed on the bayou's bank, half in the murky water, half out. The vampire raised his hands to counter the invisible force. The move was futile, for a mere vampire could not oppose it. His lips moved, trying to talk or curse, but no sound came out, though his throat worked furiously, tendons visibly taut. Latrice flicked her hands at the vampire, a move that almost seemed casual, though the momentum behind the move was anything but. The vampire opened his mouth wide, perhaps to scream, but was interrupted by a sound of cracking as though glass was giving way to weight. In unison, his fangs popped, shattering into hundreds of pieces, raining down on the still motionless body of Étienne. Go, Latrice whispered. Now. Or I'll do the same to every bone within your body. She hoped he'd take the threat seriously, though the cost to her would be great. Invoking this much power could kill a lesser witch, but for a witch of Latrice's magnitude it could render her near unconscious if she was not careful. This and the idea of starting a clan war between vampires and witches in the area was not something she wanted. Without his teeth he'd starve for a long time until they returned, but he wouldn't die. He'd be in his own personal version of hell, while his fangs regrew. Then he'd be the same. The vampire's mouth snapped shut. The glare he gave her with those crimson-rimmed eyes promised her pain if he ever had the chance. Quicker than she could have snapped her fingers, he vanished into the darkness soundlessly. Did he kill Étienne? She hoped not. She was powerful, but not omniscient. She dropped her hands, her body nearly without enough strength to stand, much less walk, but she had to take care of Étienne. She ran to his body, turned him over. The sound of applause made her jump. She whirled around, her eyes scanning the darkness, fearing the return of the vampire. Or worse, of a clan of vampires. She was lucky. A man walked up, swaggering, his stride confident, his carriage self-assured. Dark-haired, as she knew him to be. Dark-eyed, as she remembered. Latrice, he said, in the accent she remembered but had not heard in a long time. You, she said, for she knew not his name. He'd never revealed what he was called, though she'd known him for decades. What timing, Shifter? What are you doing here? She hadn't seen him in many years because he was a drifter too, never staying long. Wonderful performance, driving that bloodsucker away. Would you believe me if I told you I missed your company, Bellissima? His accent was European, but he would never tell her from where. The words he used were usually Italian, so she wondered if he wasn't from that country. When she'd asked him once the last time she'd seen him, all he'd confessed was spending a lot of time there. Why are you so worried about him? Why save him? He pointed to Étienne. It was none of his business. Help me take him to my cabin. What's in it for me? His eyes narrowed, his white tiger flashing in the depths of his eyes. What do you want, Shifter? Why wouldn't he tell her his name? Spells. You cast spells, any I want for a century. Her laugh was derisive. A decade. No more. Deal. He carried Étienne to her cabin, then made himself at home at her table. What will you do with him now? He's as good as dead. I can't let him die. And how is it you propose to keep him alive? She stared at him a long time. Realization dawned, showing on his face. No. You can't mean to do that. I'll need your blood to do it. I can't agree to that. It's not done. It's not allowed. Although there is no council here in this country yet. The shifter council in the old country would make my existence miserable if they found out I assisted you in this. I'll take the secret to my grave. She stalked toward him. I don't even know your name. She stood before him, diminutive but powerful in her magic. Give me what I seek. Make it a century of spells. 2 decades. He glared at her. She narrowed her eyes, letting him see the gravity of the situation. The urgency of the timing. I could take your life. I don't need your permission. Yes, but I know you have a particular fondness for me. True. There was something about this man. He'd been her lover once, for a short spell, after the sorcerer she'd loved had been taken from her. Then Étienne had entered her life and her future. For the last decade she'd followed, watched him, wanted to help him, but with his beliefs, he'd never accept a witch. Not even as a friend, though there would be more than friendship between them. Also, he'd never leave Marguerite. He loved his grandmother, as the mother he never had. Now Étienne's hand had been pushed. There was no Marguerite. So, you'll help? She asked the shifter again, hoping what she did would not create a hybrid of Étienne. The life of a hybrid shifter vampire was not an easy one. The conflict, the bloodlust, the bonding to a vampire. She prayed to everything she believed in, and everything she didn't. Prayed that Étienne would not become a hybrid.
Chapter 7. Étienne was no stranger to the pleasures of the flesh, not by a long shot. He'd been with a woman or two, and though the occasions had been few and far between, he knew exactly what he was waking to when he felt her on him moving, his shaft buried deeply within her. Was he in a dream? He felt strange, and in the far distance he could hear the snarls and growls of a predator. Nature took over, as nature does, and he immersed himself in the dream, enjoying the woman giving him pleasure, taking his time until his body released with an explosion that made him come undone. It was the deep roar that made him realize this wasn't a dream. The roar that permeated his mind, wreaked havoc on his body, making his nerves tingle and his muscles flex painfully. Opening his eyes, he confirmed he wasn't in a dream. There was a woman on him, her body still holding his shaft captive as she convulsed in ecstasy, her body racked with orgasms. Who are you? Étienne grabbed the woman's shoulders, at the same time trying to figure out where he was. It was one room. A cabin, as best as he could tell from a quick glance. Not one of the Arceneaux plantation cabins. No, this cabin was different. The sounds of the bayou filtered in through shuttered windows covered with sheer cloth to keep the bugs out. He sat up, the woman still in his lap, but their bodies no longer engaged. Full-breasted, full-hipped, long dark hair, beautiful cocoa skin, dark mahogany eyes that glowed with an eeriness. She wasn't right. Something about her was off, and he couldn't put his finger on it. Notably, he had to admit to himself, she was beautiful. And though she wasn't quite right, she wasn't quite wrong either. Still, he couldn't figure it out. And though he wasn't dreaming, he couldn't stop the feeling he was in a dream. Or that he was not alone within his skin. Again, he repeated his question, because she watched him carefully, her eyes nervous as though expecting him to be possessed. Who are you? I'm Latrice Mathieu. He'd heard that name. And he didn't want to ever meet it, or so he'd thought all his days. He leapt to his feet, unceremoniously dumping her into the cot he'd been sitting on. She righted herself and reached for a shift. She pulled it over her head and covered her nudity, then handed him his pants. Étienne slid them on quickly. You're a witch. Why is this happening? I am a witch. And you're not a hybrid, thankfully. She pushed her hair back from her face and stepped toward a corner of the cabin, one that functioned as a kitchen. Pulling a kettle from a low flame, she poured 2 cups of steaming greenish-yellow liquid, then handed him one. Drink. I do not drink the potions of witches. It is not a potion. It is simply a tea. Tea does not come in this color. He put the cup on the table, concerned it would spill, as it was rickety. It comes in many colors when it has herbs and spices added to it. Potions. I have no reason to trust you. That I saved your life is not reason enough. Saved my, Étienne had been ready to ask her, when he abruptly lurched into a whirlpool of memories. A vampire. Dying. Being carried. Murmurs between a woman, this woman Latrice, and a man with an accent Étienne didn't recognize. Then, he struggled with the memories. Fought to bring the elusiveness under harness. The man with the pale and poreless skin. No, that was no man. That was a creature. Vampire. The word hissed through his brain, loud and excruciating. His hand flew to his neck, feeling for the spot where the bloodsucker latched onto him. He remembered the initial stabbing pain that yielded to a euphoric pleasure before he could blink. Étienne turned his head, scanning the cabin. The witch was watching him with eyes that held understanding. And maybe a touch of pity. What happened? You were attacked. I think I died. Her expression didn't change. Why do I seem to be well now? You healed me? The witch glanced about, then said, I kept you from dying. But the baying of dogs in the distance interrupted him. They're searching for you. Damnation. He'd not thought about that. Of course, Overseer Jasper was eager to find him. Dread made adrenaline course through his body. An excruciating pain erupted in his gums, and agony crawled over his skin. Confused, Étienne looked down at his chest. Beneath his skin, stripes of black and white undulated. The stinging surge in his mouth made him bite down. Something was wrong. His teeth. He touched his fingertip to his canine. It was extended past the point it usually was. He stared at the witch, horrified. I'm turning into a vampire. Heaven help me. Odd request, since he didn't believe in heaven, but he wasn't going to dwell on that now. Would the light burn him if he went in it to run from the dogs? You're not a vampire. She stepped closer. Étienne, listen to me. You must calm down. You're making things worse. Calm down? He couldn't help his voice from rising. You are not a vampire. She enunciated each word clearly, while tapping on his chest with her finger. Now, let's get you to a hiding place before that miserable overseer is here. She stopped tapping, put both hands on his shoulders, and forced him to look into her eyes. Understand? Étienne nodded. Deep breath, she instructed. He sucked air in, blew it out slowly, his pulse subsiding. Now do as I direct you.
Chapter 8. Latrice released Étienne's shoulders and shoved the kitchen table aside, then moved the threadbare rug next to it. She leaned down and sought the loose plank that hid a latch to open the trapdoor that led beneath the cabin. Once the trapdoor was out of the way, she pointed at the rope ladder suspended into the swamp water below. Go. Wait there. She handed Étienne a reed she kept handy for times like this. Take this, get underwater, breathe through this. Do not come up before I signal. He peered down at the dark murky water, shook his head. There's gators in the swamp. This area is protected. A wire mesh wall had been built around it to keep creatures out. You will be safe. Safer than if that overseer finds you here. He nodded and slipped through the trapdoor. She put the table and the rug back in place, breathing hard from the rush, adrenaline, and exertion. No sooner had Latrice returned her cabin to its former semblance than a pounding erupted at the door. On the other side of the wood, the dogs huffed, puffed, and growled. She opened the door to a carrot-headed, pale-skinned man with red splotches on his face. In thick, freckle-dotted hands, he held ropes attached to collars on dogs that clearly feared him. Where is he? The man panted the words out. Latrice cocked her head. Who? She took a step back to allow him to peek into her cabin. That, he looked at her hard. Étienne. Except he pronounced it more like Etienne. He held his hand above his head. Ye tall-muscled. Light-skinned. I have seen no one. I'm a free woman. I don't consort with anyone. You're a witch. It is rumored, Latrice told the overseer. And you don't know where he is? We lost his trail by the creek. The shifter had carried him, so that was where the scent must have ended. Did Étienne's scent change after the ordeal? Do your dogs smell him now? If your dogs lost his scent, there's a reason. He was probably taken by a gator. The overseer narrowed his eyes. You could be right. Latrice decided the overseer should be the bayou's next victim, one night soon. I wish I could be of more help. She gave him a sticky sweet smile. You will pay. So why are you here? Yours is the nearest place. And there were small prints not far from where he was. It's not unusual for me to wander the bayou. That doesn't mean I was there when he was. Jasper squinted at her. If you're lying. You're welcome to check my cabin. She held the door wider. He stuck his head inside, glanced around, then shook his head. Without another word or even an acknowledgement, he spun on his heel, his heavy bulk making the wood on her porch groan in protest. He traveled down the ramp to the marshy ground and away from her cabin. Latrice stepped outside and closed the door behind her, watching him and his baying dogs depart. She leaned against the weathered railing of her wraparound porch, pretending she hadn't a care in the world, while she studied the stilts that kept her humble abode above the water. As soon as Jasper was out of sight, she leapt into action, made for the door and slipped inside, closing it behind her. She leaned against the wood and breathed a sigh of relief while she gathered her cool. She waited, 10 minutes at least, in case Jasper came back to double-check. When there was still no sign of him or his howling dogs, she pushed the table and rug aside and opened the trap door. The reed was there, sticking out of the water. She recognized it from the brown stain she'd applied to differentiate it from the ones that grew naturally beneath the cabin. She plucked 2 pebbles from the stash she'd placed on a tiny shelf just inside the trapdoor, and dropped them one by one on top of the reed, where she'd be sure to hit Étienne on the head so he could come out of the water. A moment later, he still hadn't come out. She dropped a handful this time. Within seconds, Étienne broke surface.
Chapter 9. Étienne sputtered and coughed. What is the meaning of that? Pelting me with rocks. You didn't come up when I sent the first signal. Jasper's gone. Étienne was reluctant to let his concern be appeased. For good? For now. She tossed him a cloth to wipe his face. Strip. I have clothing you can borrow for just this sort of thing. You won't be here long enough for your clothing to dry. You need to make haste and leave the area. Leave? Where to? Surely, you don't want to return to Arceneaux plantation. He stared at her as if absorbing the change in his situation, the change in his status. Then he shook his head. They'd catch me. The dogs would find me. He would find a way to kill me. They can't. Things are different. You are different. What happened to my teeth earlier? What about my skin? I had to save you from the vampire's death. I only had one option. You made me a vampire. No. Not that. She turned away from him, her arms crossed, but more like hugging herself than crossed. I couldn't stand by and watch you die. You would have died. Then tell me. Irritation sparked with her lack of response. You wouldn't believe me. Tell me. Anger rose, speeding the adrenaline rush that hadn't quite subsided though Jasper was gone. I can't tell you. I'd have to show you to get you to believe. Then show me, damn it all to hell. Show me what it is you can't tell me. His voice was a gravelly growl, so much so Étienne didn't even recognize it himself. Anger fueled him, making him clench his fists. His teeth ached, his head felt as if it were going to expand and explode, so acute was the pain in his skull. Now. His word was lost in a roar. Latrice whirled around, a log in her hand. She swung around and at the same time swung the heavy branch, wielding it like a mace. The limb crashed into his upper arm. Étienne's roar turned to one of pain as the anger took control. A creaking sound within his skull made him grab his head, but he couldn't hold on to it. His nails were piercing the flesh. Nails? What nails? He dropped to his knees, his head down as he studied the hands that had claws. Fur began to sprout, piercing his flesh, every strand poking agonizingly through while his flesh yielded to the fur, white with black stripes. Or black with white stripes. He couldn't tell which. His legs ached, his body pushed against his skin, his chest broadening, neck thickening, head widening. He raised his gaze to look at the witch. "What is this?" he tried to say, but the sound that came out was a snarl.
Chapter 10. Latrice looked on as confusion crossed Étienne's face while his bones shifted and he morphed. The excruciating sound of bones popping and realigning, the creaking of sinew shifting and stretching filled the air. And the whole while his snarls were angry and pain-filled. "Étienne," she whispered to get his attention, knowing his tiger hearing was supernatural and much more sensitive than his human hearing. The white tiger, magnificent, regal, massive, stopped snarling and regarded her with dark blue eyes that flared with silver highlights. He studied her, not as if she were prey, but as if he wanted to communicate with her. Would it overwhelm him if she talked to him within his shifted form? Shifters had an uncanny way of communicating with one another while in their shifted forms, by linking together in their minds and speaking silently. Witches were one of the supernatural creatures that could enter a shifter's sink and talk to them within it. "Étienne," she said into the silence, pushing for him to accept her attempts to communicate with him. "Open your mind to me." The tiger tilted his head, regarding her with a measure of suspicion. "I had to do it. I couldn't let you die. Don't you understand? And this was my only option, making you a shifter. This is your other body, your other self. You've merged spirits with a white tiger shifter that is now within you." She could feel him hesitating. She could sense he wasn't sure what to do. "Étienne, you have to let me in." His tiger face scrunched up, as if he were trying to think this through. Then she felt it, felt him opening the link between them. "I hear you in my head. Your lips are not moving. But I hear you. This is the way shifters communicate. There's no time to teach you this. No time to teach you many things. You have made me into a shape changer. They are called shifters. You are called shifters. You shift shapes. You have to leave this area. Go far away from the plantation. You'll have a long life to live. With Marguerite gone, there is nothing more to keep you here. That man will kill you if he finds you. Not if I kill him first. You know the likelihood of that happening is slim. Now go." "Where do I go?" "Boston. I'll send you to a distant cousin. You need to push your tiger into allowing you your own shape again. Learn that skill, practice it. You'll keep being a shifter a secret. You'll keep how you became one a secret. I don't even know how you did it." "Perfect."
Chapter 11. 7 years later, Boston. Étienne put on his hat, nodded to his manservant, and left his apartment. He had done well for himself. No one would recognize him for the man he used to be. No one, unless they saw his back. And no one was allowed to see his back. No one. If he was anything, Étienne was enterprising. He had found a way to become affluent, to make a lot of money, and to merge into Boston society without so much as making a ripple. His covered carriage was waiting for him by the curb. So was a surprise. Latrice. And latched onto Latrice's hand, a little girl. Not just any little girl. Étienne recognized the flash of silver in the depths of her eyes. Recognized a tiger. Shifter. There was also something else he recognized. He stared at the little girl. Her resemblance to Nana was uncanny. And Étienne had heard his mother looked just like Nana. Étienne frowned, then looked up at Latrice. "Is this?" Latrice nodded. Étienne glanced around, concerned he would be seen. Greater was his fear of being found a shifter than his fear of being found a former slave. He hustled them into his carriage, then called for the driver to go to the nearest park. Silence filled the carriage until they arrived. The whole ride, the little girl with solemn eyes and an old soul had kept watch on him. He wondered if her tigress knew who he was. He thought of that one time with Latrice. A time that should not have resulted in a child. A time that did. It had been more like a dream to him. He had never thought of the consequence. Who could have? Who would have? He had gone through so much. Changed so much. He had never given another thought to the witch that brought him where he was. All he had thought of was Marguerite's grave. He often wondered if she ever got a marker to properly commemorate her. They got out of the carriage. Étienne gave a helping hand to Latrice first and then the young one. He knew the truth the minute his fingertips touched hers. This child was his daughter. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Lucia." "Lucia, I would like to have a word with your mother. Could you play in that sandbox?" "You will have to send me far, farther than that, for my tigress will hear." Of course she would. He should have thought of that. "You are very mature for your age." She has had to be. Latrice tucked back one of Lucia's curls. "She is not safe in New Orleans. I need your help." Anger surged throughout Étienne. He reined his tiger in. "So if she had not been unsafe, I never would have known of her existence." He let the statement stand, letting his eyes and his expression reflect his emotions. "This is not the time to dwell on what we could have or should have done. Lucia needs help. She's a shifter. She's your daughter. It's too dangerous for her there without shifter skills, with all the enemies shifters have in a supernatural world. I will help. I have met some of the Arceneaux in France. They will help me recommend a good school for her. I trust you to care for her, Étienne." "I will. She's my blood. Why don't you keep her here with you? It would be better for her to go there." Chapter 12. Decades later, New Orleans. Étienne was a man on a mission. His mission? To visit Marguerite's grave. He'd made his way back to New Orleans. A long train ride. The hotel room in a city that once beheld him as a slave. It was time for his next life to begin. He lived in Boston, spent time in London, visited his daughter Lucia in Paris, though he hardly heard from her since. Once Lucia was finished with boarding school, she decided to go out into the world and very rarely maintained contact, just an occasional postcard to let him know she was still alive. Étienne took in a deep breath, letting the New Orleans air, heavy with humidity, sit on his lungs. Home. The only place he really ever called home. Though he hated it for so very long. He was at the far end of the Arceneaux plantation. Yes, he had heard it was still around but no longer used for crops. Étienne had not announced to anyone he was going to be visiting, as there was no one to announce it to. Unless he counted the ones who actually owned Arceneaux plantation. But Étienne did not accept that ownership claim. He could not. It was built on the blood of others. It was built on his family's blood. It was built on his own blood. As sure as he was standing here, the scars that crisscrossed his back tingled. The tingling was not unfamiliar, and it was never pleasant. In Étienne's head, his tiger roared with fury. Étienne soothed his tiger, though he could not soothe his own soul. He pushed emotions aside. He had one mission, and he needed to be sure he did not let emotions interfere. But for now, his purpose was to see his grandmother's grave. He was at the back of the Arceneaux property, approaching from the south. He would find the cemetery. Farther would be the cabins, if they still stood, and farther than that would be the main house, a place he'd never been to as a guest. A place he would probably never be in, as a visitor. If he had his way. If his plan worked. Étienne stepped carefully, making sure he did not scuff his shoes, for he had the trappings of a rich man. Yes, Étienne, former slave, current shifter, had become a very wealthy man. Never let it be said he did not use the mind he inherited from Marguerite. Marguerite. Nana. It was time to pay homage to the woman who'd raised him. With each step, he threw caution to the wind, not caring if he was trespassing, indifferent to the scuff marks he was leaving on his shoes, indifferent to the dirt that lined the hem of his tailored custom pants. Would the cemetery still be there? Would her marker still be there? Would it be the same marker Auchelet had originally said was there, or would it be the one they were going to replace it with? The permanent one. Now he was running, eager to see the grave, eager to talk to Nana. Eureka! The old cemetery was still intact. It was not the family cemetery. It never had been. This was the burial grounds for his people. He pushed the thought away. There it was. His shifter vision, supernatural as it was, could see his grandmother's name clearly etched into a gray stone. Étienne knelt by the graveside. The last time he had been here, he had seen the shell. Of course that was gone now. In whose hands, who knew? I wondered how long you'd be able to stay away. He knew that voice even years later. Latrice. He peered up at her. Different times here now, she said, but looked no different herself. I noticed. Would you like this? I saved it for you. She held out her hand. The shell. Étienne rose, put out his hand. You. Her simple act of kindness caught him off guard. Thank you. She nodded her acknowledgement. He searched for something to say, the silence heavy and uncomfortable. Has Lucia been in touch? The last time she sent me a postcard, she said she was headed back to Paris. Latrice hesitated, then answered. She's visited a few times. I'm often overcome by guilt, feeling as though I've failed her. I'd have to say, I'm a failure in the mothering department. First I give Lucia up as a young child, then Rochelle becomes? She sighed, stopped talking. Rochelle. My other daughter. I didn't know. He'd always felt he and Latrice were in different worlds. You had no reason to know anything about me or my life. A part of me feels like I should. We share a daughter, after all. Share. Latrice's laugh was self-deprecating. Lucia has been her own person since she could walk and talk, probably at 2. I'm wondering if it's the shifter part of her that influences that. I have no experience with shifters other than having raised her for those few first years. I wasn't born into shifterhood, so I'm not the one to ask. How is it, being a shifter? Where could he begin? His life had changed so drastically after that night. It's very different. I met other shifters. Learned about being one. I think the hardest part is the longevity. How can I love someone when I know they'll die before me? So I've avoided emotions. I guess judging from how you look, witches live a long time too. Not as long as shifters. The shifters you knew didn't tell you about the couple bond. He scoured her face for an explanation. What is that? The act that bonds a shifter and his mate. Étienne thought about that day, when they'd coupled and created Lucia. Is that how one becomes a shifter? Is that what you did to me? No. What I did was completely different. And forbidden. Witches who do that face penalties if caught. Were you caught? I am no longer head witch. You paid a steep price. He turned the shell over and over between his fingertips, occasionally rubbing it with his thumb, noting the smooth texture inside the shell. Then he tucked it in a pocket for safekeeping. It was a price well worth it. He didn't ask her to expand on her mysterious words, allowing the silence to settle around them and lay heavy. Thank you for the shell. You're welcome. I'm sorry about your grandmother. I'm sorry if you aren't happy as a shifter, but I really had no choice, not if I was going to save your life. With a nod, halfway to a thank you, he did appreciate her saving his life now. Early on, it had been difficult, being a shifter, being in a strange new world, and sharing his body, mind, and heart with another being. Luckily, he got along with his tiger, and they'd formed a close bond. He glanced at Nana's grave, wondering what she'd think of all this. "I'll leave you be. Welcome back, Étienne." He didn't look up from the grave, but his astute shifter hearing picked up the sound of her departing footsteps. Was he back? Would he stay? More than 8 decades later, was he ready to let the past stay in the past? He inhaled deeply. The smell of the land was the same. The bayou hadn't changed. The scenery in town had changed, but here on Arceneaux plantation things had not changed, had they? "You're trespassing." How the hell had anyone snuck up on him? He must have been too engrossed in his thoughts. Rising quickly, Étienne whirled around.
Chapter 13. Celine Arceneaux had watched the man from the shade of a large live oak. Broad shoulders, a proud carriage to his head, a dignified mournful expression on a strikingly handsome face. A full bottom lip yielded sensuality to an upper lip. Eyes that didn't seem to miss a thing scanned the wooded area around him. He paused, staring in her direction. For a brief second, Celine thought he'd seen her. She held her breath, ready for the man to come forward and halfway wishing he would. But no, he looked down, concentrating on whatever task he had at hand, which didn't seem to be more nefarious than paying tribute to the grave before him. He was trespassing, of course he was. But he was kneeling in front of a grave, and his lips had been moving, as if he were talking to whoever was buried there. Still, he's trespassing. Maybe he's a grave robber. No, he looked nothing like a grave robber. She knew expensive clothing. That suit was tailor-made. And the shoes were clearly not cheap. Boldly but on stealthy feet, she approached the stranger. "You're trespassing." After the words had come out of her mouth, it occurred to her that approaching a trespasser by herself was foolhardy. Headstrong even. Dangerous, perhaps. She knew her father would have agreed with those assessments, though he'd have been smiling when he did. The man rose and whirled around with such speed her heart missed a beat. His eyes narrowed, studying her. Then her heart missed several beats, and that had absolutely nothing to do with the speed with which he'd moved. She swallowed, finding her usual sassy self without words, without saliva, without thoughts. Except for the thoughts that lingered on the man before her. Eyes still slit so she couldn't discern the hue, he spoke. "On whose land?" His voice. God, his voice. It called to her, striking deep within her soul with the effectiveness of an arrow that sailed true straight to its target. She dry swallowed, willing the words to come out. Willing the words not to be a jumble of cacophony that gave away what his very presence did to her. Arceneaux land. Philip Arceneaux's land. He's still alive. He is, though father's not always well.
Chapter 14. Étienne's tiger roared so loudly in his head, he was almost unable to hear the woman's words, even with his shifter hearing. His tiger roared, huffed, chuffed, then emitted snarls, prowling around in Étienne's head, not giving him a moment's concentration on the matter at hand. The woman at hand. Étienne stared at the woman before him. He couldn't help it if he'd wanted to. Brilliant red hair that sparked in the sunlight. Eyes that glowed with intelligence. A body curved perfectly when so many others seemed like willows that were frail and not made for loving. Tantalizing and attractive as her figure and looks might be, this was not what attracted Étienne to her. No, there was something within the woman, something that wrenched at Étienne with a force stronger than the pull of a force of nature. He tried to shut his tiger out while he worked on sorting through his thoughts about this woman, but the tiger wasn't having it. Not one bit. Then what the woman said clicked. It more than clicked, really. It hit Étienne with the force of a sledgehammer. Philip was her father. He's your father? He forced the words out. My stepfather, actually. He married my mother while I was a newborn. He's not a young man. No. Not at all. A glimmer of sadness shone in her eyes. Your mother. Étienne stalled for time, trying to process. This woman was the stepdaughter of the man who fathered him. So you're not his blood relative. He had to reaffirm that. No. Her red hair caught the sun's glint. In all his years, he'd never been so enamored of a woman. He'd never found his tiger so engrossed in one. Étienne continued with his questions, hoping she would not run off, hoping she'd be open to answering. I had thought he left when he went to college. I had heard when he went to college, he never returned. She gave him a curious look. He and mother moved here after they married. He adopted me. So sometime while Étienne had been in the north, making a fortune, his father Philip had married this woman's mother and moved back. And your name? She plucked at the hem of her sleeve, as if at odds with herself about answering. Celine. Yours? Étienne. You're French? Perhaps somewhere back there. How would he explain this one? If he ever had a chance to explain it. He'd like to see more of this mysterious woman who'd been raised by the man that fathered him so long ago. Is this land for sale? Celine stepped backward, as if offended or taken aback perhaps. I'm sure it's not. It's been in father's family for ages. Does he have children? She gave him a weird look, her lips in a straight line. I mean other than you, Étienne corrected himself. No. I'm it. So this will be your property when he goes. She gasped. Shook her head. How ghastly. I didn't mean to be. Yes, it will be mine, but I don't want to think about a life without my father. He never had any other children. Just me. You certainly do have a lot of questions about my father. You didn't tell me your last name. Arceneaux. Another gasp. You're related? Distantly.
Chapter 15. Celine was taken aback. Since when did she stand in the woods, speaking to a total stranger about something as intimate as her family history? And yet, how could it be that it felt like the most natural thing in the world? But the pull she felt for this man was undeniably strong. And she felt as if they'd known each other for ages. She studied his face. He'd said he was distantly related to her stepfather. Maybe that was what made her feel so comfortable with him. You've been to Arceneaux plantation before. Though it wasn't a question, he nodded, agreeing with her. Long ago. I don't remember you. Maybe you were not here. She frowned, trying to think of a circumstance, decided it wasn't really impossible. Why don't we go up to the main house? See my father. I'm sure he'd like to see a relative, distant or otherwise. It was his turn to frown, his hands flexed, then, as if realizing he was tightening them into fists, he opened them fully and nodded. I'd like to meet your mother and Philip. She paused. We lost my mother a long time ago. That's when Philip adopted me. I'm sorry. The way he said he was sorry made her think he knew her pain, that he knew the hurt of losing a parent. And your parents? He shook his head. No more. Celine chewed on her lip. Let's go. Tea would hit the spot right now, wouldn't it? She waved her hand, indicating he should lead the way, but instead he held his own hand out. Ladies first.
Chapter 16. Tea does sound good, Celine Arceneaux. He relished the way her name rolled off his tongue. The way saying it felt as intimate as holding her, kissing her, claiming her. Her name was perfect. It fit her. He took his jacket off, draped it over his forearm, and walked behind her, noting the swing of her hips beneath her skirt, the way the fabric clung to her curves, accentuated her derriere. She glanced back, caught him appraising her figure. Étienne held her gaze. Her eyes were locked on his. She wasn't going to back down. Her head tilted slightly, just so. Étienne fought the urge to step closer and seize her in a kiss. His tiger snarled at Étienne's self-restraint. Her gaze traveled to his lips. The slightest tip of her tongue slipped out, and it was evident she had no idea what she was doing to him as it ran the course of her tempting bottom lip. Étienne muffled a groan, still fighting his passion and his tiger. She broke their gaze and broke the spell, turning and pointing. "We'll cut through there." Étienne gave her a nod, for there'd be no way to talk. His mouth was dry, his throat felt full of sawdust. His pants had become a constraint, and a painful reminder that the human side of him was so very affected by this red-haired temptress. A few yards forward, he'd barely regained his composure, when he felt a tingling sensation beginning on his shoulder blade and traveling down to meet at the center of his lower back. With every step, the tingling intensified, until within a few yards it had turned into a burn. Confused, Étienne stopped. Celine turned and looked at him. "Is everything all right?" "Yes." What was he supposed to say? He reached up to touch his back, confused that sweat would be dripping so profusely suddenly. The hand he drew back was tinged with blood. Horrified, Celine gasped. "Is that blood?" "Of course it is." "Why are you bleeding?" Think fast, think fast." Étienne shook his head. "It's nothing. I hurt myself." He glanced around. The cabins were within sight, a stone's throw away. Memories flooded through him. He remembered so much. Rage and helplessness followed the memories. The burn was becoming stronger and stronger. He could feel the bleeding increasing. He looked at his hand. Beneath the skin, black and white stripes had begun to undulate. His teeth ached. The shift was coming. He had to get away from her. Had to get away before he became a tiger. Celine stepped closer. "We should get you to the house and get that tended to immediately." No. The last thing he needed was to have her see his back. "I have to go. Now." Celine stared at Étienne's departing back. Étienne was moving faster than she imagined anyone ever had. His white shirt was crimson in some areas, scarlet crisscross patterns. "Wait." She ran after him. He whirled around. "Go away. Do not follow me." His words were more of a snarl. A silver light glowed in his eyes. Celine froze. She was still standing open-mouthed when he vanished into the woods. Chapter 17. Étienne fought to control the shift. The shift into his tiger had begun as he was running from Celine. He glanced back to verify she was out of sight. She was. Panting, he paused and tried to regain control of his shift. He inhaled, releasing his breath slowly, the slight creaking sound of his bones realigning, his tendons returning to his human form. He dropped to his knees. Weakened from nearly completely shifting into his tiger, then returning to his human form, Étienne made his way to the nearest tree trunk and leaned against it, eyes closed against the sensations and the memories. It had been a long time since he'd condemned Latrice for the ill-omened curse she'd put on him. Years. No, decades since he'd regretted the day she'd chosen to make him a shifter. Today, he cursed Latrice again. Cursed her for leaving him alive to remember the hell of it. Étienne sat for hours, his shirt drying, sticking to his flesh. The mosquitoes buzzing nearby, the flies too, but no insect and no animal approached him. It was as if they knew the depth and length of his fury. Hours and hours, until darkness had fallen. And still, though it was dark, his shifter's supernatural sight allowed him to see details as clearly as if it were day. Every tree, every plant, every silhouette. He rose to his feet on unsteady legs. He should go into town, pack, and leave this area, leave the pain behind. He should have no interest in conquering the pain, no interest in fighting this battle. And yet, he strode in the opposite direction, straight to the belly of the beast. He stood before the clearing, studying the cabins, his back on fire, blood seeping into his shirt. The lean-to he'd been held in the night before he left, the night Nana had been buried, was long gone. In its place, a bush had grown and a sapling had taken sprout. Farther down at the end, there it was, Nana's cabin. All of the cabins were still standing. Each and every one. And they looked no different than they had when he'd left. He walked toward Nana's. His feet wanted to trudge, but his heart pushed him forward, eager to see his grandmother's home. As he reached the door, he raised his hand, instinct and habit strong, even after decades had passed. He had raised his hand to scratch. Old habits. The door opened slightly, like it always had. His movement stilled, his breath frozen in his lungs. A frown drew his brows down. A face appeared in the doorway. White. Whiter than a sheet. Without a single pore. A mocking grin on its lips showing razor-sharp fangs. In Étienne's mind, his tiger roared. Étienne couldn't move. Not forward nor backward. Whom were you expecting? Your grandmother? Surely you know Marguerite met her dark visitor the night after she saw him. Met him for the final time. This was the confounded being that took Étienne's life. The knowledge made his tiger's snarls louder in his mind. His nostrils flared, his jaw tightened. What do you know of the dark visitor my grandmother saw? And though Étienne asked the question, a shadowy and horrifying explanation began to make its way in his mind, coming to the forefront of his brain. The creature laughed, opened the door wider, and took a bow at the waist. He waved his hands with a flourish as he rose from the bow. The dark visitor, at your service. You. Étienne's hands became fists. You killed her? Oh, come now. The vampire strode deeper into the cabin, indicating for Étienne to join him, showing him the chair as if he were a gracious host. Étienne's glimpse around the cabin was cursory, for his attention was much more focused on the vampire. But he did take notice that the cabin was unchanged. He knew instantly it was even the same table where he'd carved his name on the leg when he'd been young. Don't act surprised, the vampire continued. Who did you think the dark visitor was, after all? The Grim Reaper. How would I know? I thought it was in her mind. And yet, though Étienne was managing to maintain a calm conversation with his grandmother's killer, he found himself planning the creature's demise. The vampire laughed. The noise hollow and ethereal in the cabin's darkness, the dirt floor absorbing the sounds of mirth. Do not even think it, shifter. Étienne tried to control his surprise at the vampire's knowledge that he was a shifter. He felt the minute widening of his eyes, fought to keep his tiger at bay. How did he know? Your naivete is amusing. Did you learn nothing during your time in the North? Nothing in Boston. Nothing in Paris. The witch did you a disservice by not setting you up with a clan of shifters to acclimate you to life as a shifter. Don't you know it's rude to talk about someone behind their back? Latrice. Étienne spun partway, glancing at her, then immediately turned back to the vampire. Witch. Sorceress. Why are you here? Flattery. Latrice's smile for the vampire was not genuine. Why are you Nightwalker? She entered the room, stood next to Étienne. It is not your concern. It is. Because he is the father of your child. The vampire sneered. Latrice's eyes narrowed, as though she hadn't been aware the vampire knew of Lucia's heritage. Then she gave as good as she got. Because you were rebuffed by Marguerite's daughter. Because though you applied that vampire charm of yours, tried to compel her to love you, instead she loved Philip. Because you could not lure her to the night side of life. To your life. The vampire flew toward Latrice, his body moving so fast that Étienne's shifter vision struggled to keep up with the creature. You do not know what you speak of, witch. Him. Latrice drew the sound out, almost mocking him. The vampire reached one talon-tipped hand out, the blur of his fingers in front of Étienne's face. It took a second for Étienne to realize what had happened. He touched his face, drew his fingers across his cheekbone, and bit back the utter of surprise when he saw the blood there. You have a death wish. Latrice's tone was unlike one Étienne had heard before. Oh. The vampire tilted his head, as though trying to be coy. You would give me the same courtesy as you gave the overseer Jasper. Étienne looked at Latrice. That's right, shifter, the vampire said. That carrot-topped blob of a man was an alligator appetizer less than a week after you left, courtesy of your witch lover. "This is true?" Étienne asked her. She nodded, her gaze never leaving the vampire. Étienne tried to process all this. His mother had history with this vampire, who'd also killed his grandmother, and almost killed him. A slow burning rage took place in Étienne's gut. This bastard had inflicted more than his share of pain on Étienne's family. Étienne yielded control of his body to his tiger, succumbing to his tiger's will, ready to give the tiger the chance to get Étienne what his heart desired. Retribution. But strangely enough, the image that crossed his mind was the auburn hair and full lips of Celine Arceneaux. He shook thoughts of her away. He had business right here, right now. Urgent, pressing business. He felt it start in his skin. The pulsing, the rippling, the beginning of his tiger's fur to form under the top layer, ready to pop out. Next were the tendons, sinew, and muscles, all stretching, yielding to his tiger size. The excruciating part was when his bones began to transform, widening, stretching, thickening. Étienne grunted from the discomfort. "Your circus tiger is performing a trick for us," the vampire said. Étienne shook his head, half tiger, half human. He reared his head, a roar building in his throat. The vampire drove forward, his talons digging into Étienne's flesh as his fangs began a descent toward the soft flesh of Étienne's neck. "No." Latrice raised her hands, her eyes glowed, her fingers stiff. An energy burst out of her, pushing forward a shock of lightning. The vampire released his hold on Étienne and turned his attention to her. She flicked her hands, flipping her wrist. The vampire released a howl, his mouth open wide. Étienne's supernatural hearing picked up the sound of crackling. A hairline crack formed on one of the fangs. The tooth shattered, tiny fragments flying everywhere. Red tears began to flow down the vampire's cheeks. His second fang shattered. The vampire's hands dropped to his sides. "Don't. Please. Don't. I should have done this a long time ago. A long, long time ago." Latrice snapped her fingers. With a loud shattering sound muffled by the vampire's skin, the being folded in and on himself, becoming a lump of white poreless skin inside a black suit. Latrice clapped her hands together, as if dusting them of dirt. "That's that. Why did you never tell me?" Étienne could not tear his eyes away from the desiccated skin of the vampire lump on the dirt floor of the cabin. She stood silent, her back stiff. "You could have warned me." Étienne began to pace the room. "You could have warned my grandmother. There are some things I did not know. I wish he died by my hand. I could not afford to let you do that. You see, if you blood shared with him, you'd have ended up a hybrid." Étienne looked up from the vampire's husk of a corpse. "What is a hybrid?" Latrice shook her head. "It's a difficult way for a shifter to be in. I've only met one. He killed the vampire that he'd blood shared with, which in turn killed him." Étienne winced. "So their lives were bound together?" "Indeed. I should thank you for saving me from that outcome. It's the least I could do since I put you into this one." "Why did you?" "It was fated." There was a sadness on her face. It was a sadness Étienne didn't fully understand, but he wasn't going to pry. "My back, the bleeding." "Yes, I noticed." "Theories on that?" He had his own suspicions, obvious to him at least, but he was interested in her opinion. "Your tiger. He will not let it rest. There is no retribution for this, but he will not let it go." Étienne nodded. His thoughts as well. "You should come to the cabin. I've got someone in from out of town. Now. It's well after dark." Étienne walked up the cabin's ramp. The place he'd been turned looked the same. "So about shifters. The ones in Paris, they said shifters were born, not turned. Did you dispel their thoughts? Or did you tell them how you came to be one?" "I did not tell them." The door to Latrice's cabin opened. Out stepped Lucia. "Tell them what?" "You are eavesdropping," Latrice said, hugging their daughter, fully grown, beautiful, her tigress's spirit a white glow in Lucia's eyes. her dark hair long in loose braids. "It's not eavesdropping if you can't help it." Lucia gave a half shrug that reminded Étienne of the time he'd been in Paris. "So very old-world European." "You look well," he told her, beaming with pride at the composed and confident woman before him. She was a full-grown woman, that with her shifter blood and her witch blood had barely aged. "As do you. You hardly appear to be as old as you surely must be." "I didn't know you were coming to Louisiana," Étienne said, not trying to make her feel guilty, but definitely feeling slighted, since his only child didn't tell him her travel plans. "One could say the same of you," Lucia countered. Étienne nodded. She had a point. "I'm surprised to see you here," Lucia added. "I had demons to put to rest," he said. Lucia glanced between them. "I hope my mother isn't one of those demons." "I bear no ill feelings toward your mother." Étienne was puzzled. "What would give you that idea?" "I was born a shifter," Lucia said, her voice low. You had different circumstances." "You told her?" Étienne asked. "She deserves to know. Of all people, second to you, she deserves to know." Étienne pondered this. It was true. Lucia did deserve to know her heritage. Anyone else? Latrice shook her head. "I'll take it to my death." Étienne turned back to his daughter. "What brought you to New Orleans? How long will you stay? What are you doing with yourself these days?" "Staying out of trouble." He picked up on the fact she was not going to tell him anything else, and still persisted. "Where are you headed after you leave here?" Lucia studied him long and hard. They'd never bonded the way he'd wanted to as father and daughter, but it wasn't surprising. "Quake first. Then I'm going north again." Latrice gave Étienne a look as though she commiserated with him. As if she had the same sort of relationship with their daughter, who'd been conceived under odd circumstances and raised in even stranger ones, spending more of her formative years with teachers at schools than she had with her parents. Maybe one day, they'd have a visit about how his life had been, no mother raised by a grandmother, becoming a shifter, being free. One day. Maybe. Chapter 18. And so Étienne spent the last few hours of the night in the company of the daughter he hadn't raised, with the witch that saved his life, and yet changed it in such a way he wondered if he were cursed or blessed. They talked about nothing really, and yet about tiny things. At dawn, Lucia stood and announced she was leaving. Étienne rose, not only to walk her out but also to leave. He'd never felt close to Latrice, and several short hours did nothing to change that. "Be well," he told the witch, not planning to see her ever again. He shrugged his jacket on. "And you?" Latrice understood, it seemed. Étienne had barely started the trek through the wooded undergrowth, ready to find the car he'd parked not far from his grandmother's grave, when he felt eyes on him. His shifter senses were back in working order, thankfully. He scanned the area as casually as he could, to ascertain the intent of whoever was watching him. He saw the hair first, and bit back the smile that came to his mind and his heart. And his tiger's heart it would seem as well, for the beast chuffed with something very close to happiness. "The dew is still on the leaves, Miss Arceneaux." "So it is, Mr. Arceneaux." "Do you always take constitutionals at this time of the morning?" "Do you always trespass at this time of the morning?" Her wit, her snappy repertoire, it did nothing more than endear her to Étienne. Her loveliness was outshined by her cleverness. "I was on an errand, and now I'm making my way back to the car so I may trouble you and trespass no more." It saddened him to speak the words, for he wanted to trouble her. He wanted to be the source of many things for her, and if one of those was troubling, so be it. "And your errand was at Latrice Mathieu's cabin." "A suspected witch." His gaze snapped to her eyes. "How is it you know where I was? Were you following?" Surely he'd have known or noticed. "I was on my way to see her myself." "You have business with a woman who lives in a dilapidated cabin on the bayou. One who is suspected of being a witch." I was hoping to get healing herbs and some advice from her. Advice? Is it love potions you desire, Miss Arceneaux? I would think those would not be needed. Not by you. He was rewarded with a tinge of pinkness in her cheeks, and he enjoyed the discomfort of her modesty, not to mention her humility. No. Mr. Arceneaux, I was seeking assistance for one of the young ones at the orphanage. He cocked a brow. There was much he did not know about her, and he wanted to know everything. He wanted to be in her head, in her body, in her presence. Forever. What orphanage? The one where I volunteer. He was beginning to like this woman even more. Could I see the orphanage? See what you do there? To what end? She eyed him suspiciously, but there was a gleam in her gaze, one of admiration and something more. He hoped it was a lot of somethings more. Perhaps I'd like to volunteer. She let out a tiny laugh. With you, he added. She smiled, and his tiger's chuffing became so loud he feared he'd not hear her if she spoke. He calmed his tiger, advising him to lower the volume. Then he added, perhaps I'd like to invest in the orphanage. I am not a poor man. No, but you are a man of mystery. And I have questions for you. I for you as well. Why is a young lady out alone? The woods are not safe. Why would I have needed a chaperone on my father's property? That was yesterday, he reminded her. But today you're not on your property, not right now. Perhaps I have secrets of my own. Your father does not know you visit the witch. No. And does not know the extent of my volunteering at the orphanage. At least, he doesn't think I do what I do. He thinks I help with the administrative duties. But you prefer to work with the children. She nodded, her face serious. It seems we both have secrets, Mr. Arceneaux. Étienne, he corrected her. Étienne, she repeated. His body stiffened in the best of ways when his name slipped off her tongue, the way her lips were left in the tiniest of moves. It would not be easy to spend time with this woman and not want her. He wanted her in the worst of ways. So perhaps I could visit the orphanage with you sometime, he persisted. Sometime. She took a few steps toward the direction of Latrice's cabin. And perhaps that day you can tell me why your shirt was bloody. And why you visit a witch. Your orphans may not be the only ones that need healing, Miss Arceneaux. Celine, she turned to tell him. Celine, he amended. Chapter 19. For several reasons, Étienne decided to wait a week to make his first move. Not because he needed time for his back to heal, but because he had to be sure about his feelings for Celine. The healing wasn't an issue, because, thankfully, one of the perks of being a shifter included accelerated healing. And so for that week, every day without fail, Étienne followed her. He followed her when she went to the orphanage, traveling in her father's car driven by the family chauffeur. She spent all day at the orphanage, every day. He watched from nearby as she brought one child after another out to the playground and visited with them, bringing them toys. He noticed there was one little girl she spent the most time with. And though he was afar, his shifter hearing and vision allowed him to hear and see as if he were there. The little girl was named Claudette, and she couldn't have been any older than Lucia was when he first met her. Claudette clung to Celine's skirt. Please don't go. I have to. I'm having dinner with my father. You don't understand how hard it is here for me. Claudette stared up at Celine's face. The timbre of Claudette's voice had changed, as had her accent. He studied the little girl, watching her closely. Suddenly her eyes flashed a deep indigo, transfusing her native color, overtaking it, then subsiding. Étienne stared. Claudette's eyes, they had gone through the color-changing occurrence the way shifter eyes did, but not exactly. Similar, but different. If she wasn't a shifter, and she wasn't, then what was she? He shook his head. Surely he was imagining things. What about I bring you along to dinner one day? I'll get special permission from Mrs. Brown. Étienne surmised that must have been someone in charge at the orphanage. Claudette jumped up and down with glee. Today? No. But soon. I promise. Claudette nodded and took Celine's hand, allowing her to lead her inside the 3-story red brick building. During the last week, Étienne had noticed every morning that Celine would go into the orphanage fresh-faced and with impeccable clothing, and every evening she'd come out, her hands raw, her sleeves wet. Her hair would be pulled in a bun, though many tendrils had escaped and were plastered to her forehead and temples. He suspected Celine spent much time cleaning after she'd had her visits in the playground with the children. He smiled, watching from afar, as he took note of how she spent her days. No wonder she didn't want him going with her. She did not want her secret out. He waited for her, as the late afternoon hours cooled and yielded to the evening's temperature. She was usually out by this time, and getting into her father's chauffeured car. But no sign of her yet. He wasn't concerned. Who was he kidding? Yes, he was. Another 10 minutes, and I'll go in after her. He took the timepiece out of his pocket. 10 minutes. That was all he'd give her. He had cause for concern. He was not popular with at least one vampire. Who knew what other beings wanted to see his demise? And if they wanted to see him dead, it would stand to reason they'd exact the same on those who he was close to. Ah. There she is. Celine strode out of the orphanage, took the steps hastily, and then, to his surprise, rather than getting into her father's car, she said something to the driver, then headed down the sidewalk. Straight toward the park bench where Étienne was seated, pretending to read a newspaper. He kept the paper up, his nose buried in it, blocking her vision of him and his of her. He felt her weight as the park yielded to the pressure, but pretended he was oblivious. Étienne. Hum. He lowered the paper, raised his eyes. I mean Celine. Fancy meeting you here. She shook her head, mirth in her eyes. If this had been the only day you'd been here, I'd understand the surprise. Or maybe you're astonished that I know you've been here all week. Why are you following me? Who said I've been here all week? He hoped that denial, or, at the very least, a question would divert her attention. My little friend Claudette is very, very observant. And not what she seems. He wondered if Celine was aware of that. I see. Perhaps I should have bribed her. She's extremely loyal to me. I can certainly see why. I would be. Her cheeks gave in to a blush as she chewed on her lower lip. I think it's time you stop by Arceneaux plantation. Tonight? Yes, for dinner. I told Cookie to set an extra place. That's sure of my answer. I won't take no. And you should meet my father. Why is that? He smiled at her sassiness. Because you're going to court me. Indeed he was. Étienne nodded, enjoying her strength and her headstrong ways. Étienne had given the cabins a wide berth, so as not to arrive at Arceneaux plantation with a bloody shirt. He made his way up the imposing stairway to the massive front door. He'd never been in the house when he was here before, so he had no memories of it. And hopefully, nothing that will start that infernal bleeding again. He'd thought when he left Boston to come to New Orleans, he'd buy the property so he could ensure Nana's grave would always be cared for. He hadn't expected his reaction to the cabins. He'd never have thought he'd end up with the problem he had. It made him rethink the idea of buying and living here. He'd have to come up with another solution. But for now, he told himself, he'd put it all on hold and enjoy an evening with Celine. And my father. That thought was as foreign to him as the word father was. He had no feelings for Philip Arceneaux. As far as Étienne was concerned, he was no different than any other stranger. The door opened before he knocked. The man who opened it was the driver. It made him wonder if finances were not what they appeared, if the butler doubled as a driver. Étienne Arceneaux for Miss Celine, he told the man. She's in the sitting room. He gestured for Étienne to bear right. Celine appeared in the doorway of the first room. Étienne. So happy you could make it. Thank you for inviting me. I hope I'm not late. Just in time. Perfect timing, actually. Bart just brought Father downstairs. He usually takes his meals in his room. She leaned close. He's blind. I don't know if I mentioned that. Étienne was taken aback. No, you had not. Yes, it set in about a decade ago. It's why he is housebound, refusing to leave. That an age. She shook her head. Étienne waved for Celine to precede him, taking a second to compose himself from the surprise while he followed behind her. He wouldn't have wanted to admit it, but he'd been nervous with the idea of meeting the man who loved his mother, a woman he never met, the man who should have been his father but instead was not. Celine? That was definitely an older man's voice coming from the room. Étienne entered, glanced right. The man had once been good-looking, it was clear in his bone structure. The eyes, unfocused and unseeing, were a greenish blue, the hair a dark brown. Étienne couldn't help but notice the resemblance to himself. I hear someone. Something, Philippe Arceneaux said. I told you we'd have company tonight, Father, remember? A distant cousin. Philip moved his head left and right, as if trying to determine where Étienne was. Good to meet you. He held his hand out. Philippe Arceneaux. Étienne took that hand, old and wrinkled, he shook it. Étienne Arceneaux. Pleased to meet you. I've heard, what could he say? Good things? No. What should he say? My grandmother mentioned you more than once. He breathed out. Who was your grandmother? Your name does not ring a bell. Étienne dug through his memory bank of all the research he'd done on the Arceneaux. He plucked the name of a cousin that had moved far away and long since passed. Amélie. Oh. Yes, I barely saw her after her father married the second time. She spoke of you often. I'm glad you stopped by to visit. What brings you to New Orleans? Business. Hoping to buy some property. Really? Where? Yours? I haven't determined that yet. Let me know if you need any connections. I don't get out as much, but I know a few folks. Philip turned his head. Celine, where's dinner? I'm starving. The meal had been surreal. Visiting with the man who had fathered him made Étienne's head spin, and it was already spinning because of Celine's presence. Thankfully, it was over, and the older man had been taken upstairs by the nurse who'd hovered over him the entire meal. Étienne sat with Celine on the veranda, overlooking a large maze in front with a gazebo to one side and a magnificent lighted fountain on the other side of the maze. I'd like to declare my intentions, he said, taking her hand. It's like you're from another era. I love that about you. Back to my declaration, Celine. I'd love for you to court me, Étienne Arceneaux. I've never met a man like you. You. She turned her gaze away, focusing on the fountains. You thrill and scare me. You have nothing to fear of me. He squeezed her hand gently, hoping to reassure her. This house is beautiful. The land. All of it. Thank you. Celine smiled. I love it here. You don't plan to move to the big city. To be where the action is. This is exactly where I've always wanted to be. This is where my friends are. Where they always have been. Friends. There is something you should know about me. Étienne leaned back and studied the woman he'd come to love. You can't change my mind. I don't want to. But I think you should know. It's only fair we not begin this with secrets. He nodded but found himself reticent, what with his own secrets. What is it I should know about you then? She took a deep breath. I see the ones who have passed to the other side. He pondered her statement. You mean the dead? She nodded, her face having lost its color. It used to frighten me. They try to get me to follow them, to join them. I wear this to protect myself. She fished into the neckline of her top, pulled out a cross. That helps. You don't sound like a believer, Étienne. I believe. In other things. Her glance said she doubted him. You have secrets too, she told him. I do. Was she equipped to handle his secrets? That she saw ghosts was one thing, but that was very different from watching a man turn into a tiger. You will share them with me? Not tonight. They sat that way, quietly, holding hands, listening to crickets and bullfrogs, the occasional breeze brushing across their flesh. A long time they sat there, drawing comfort from each other's touch, pulling one another deeper and deeper into the place they'd fallen. His tiger was making soft snarling sounds in Étienne's head. For the first time ever, the tiger sounded content, not angry nor vengeful. Finally, when the clock inside struck the 10 o'clock hour, she turned to him, her eyes dark and liquid in the dimness, now that the candles they'd had on the table between them had long vanquished. I should check on father. Guilt at keeping his secrets aided Étienne as he bid Celine a good night.
Chapter 20. 2 weeks later, Celine was an everyday event in Étienne's life. She was more than an event. She was his everything. Quiet dinners alone at the Arceneaux plantation. An occasional dance in town. A movie at the city's theater. A play. Walks in the park. Étienne had not seen Philippe Arceneaux again. Étienne and Philippe were hardly more than strangers still. Celine had said he had been unwell, and that the doctors had been visiting more than usual. And then one morning, Celine appeared in the drawing room of the house he'd leased. Her eyes were bloodshot. Father is gone. He attended the funeral. A town full of people had come out to bury the man who'd been a part of the past. They'd placed him to rest at St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans, amongst a maze of tombs that Étienne would not be likely to find again, at least not easily, nor would he want to. Philippe had been Celine's father, though not by birth, but he was not Étienne's father, though he'd sired him. And as far as Étienne was concerned, that was that. Historic and beautiful, ornate ironwork, marble tombs reminiscent of a Greco-Roman style, it was hard for Étienne not to contrast it with his own grandmother's grave. Étienne had little memory of the day of Philippe Arceneaux's funeral, blocked it completely, for reasons he would never discuss with anyone, and wasn't even sure he wanted to think of himself. A month lapsed, a month during which Étienne was Celine's shoulder and guardian, listening to her grieve the man who'd raised her, feeling her pain as he'd felt when he lost his grandmother. A month of revealing no secrets. A month before she told him she wanted to know his secrets. Had waited long enough. It seemed to be the time for Étienne to divulge. He'd become almost unable to restrain his passion, and his tiger could scent her desire for him, rising between the fabric of her clothing. Sitting in the drawing room at Arceneaux plantation, Étienne looked into her eyes. What he saw there told him he needed to open up and let her in. He needed to introduce her to his tiger. He needed to make her his mate. He needed to make her his forever. He took her hand, and they walked down the staircase and around the back toward the cabins. Along the way, Étienne removed his jacket, unbuttoned his shirt, and removed that as well. Celine looked at him, concern in her eyes, and yet she said nothing. It was as if she trusted him fully. I know what you will see will test you, Étienne began. But I hope it will not test what we have and who we are. Celine tucked her hand in his. Nothing can. Knowing what you know about me, knowing how you accept me, surely you realize we cannot be tested. Étienne hoped this was true. He stopped in the middle of the path. I think this is far enough. He could tell from the tingling on his shoulder blades, next would come the burning, and after that the bleeding.
Chapter 21. Far enough? Celine turned to face Étienne. For now. He put his hands on the hem of his tank-top muscle shirt, then raised the shirt above his head. Confused, Celine stared at him. He turned around, his back toward her. She gasped. His back was a study of crisscross scars, raised marks darker than the rest of his flesh. Who did that to you? Wait. Please. No questions yet. Just stay behind me as we walk. Étienne began to walk, slow steps, facing forward, while she watched his muscular back. They had not gone more than half a dozen steps before the first drop appeared. A large drop, the reddest of crimsons, had formed at the edge of one of the scars. Horrified, Celine said nothing. And still he walked. And with each step, another drop would appear. Drop after drop after drop, until the drops were a rivulet, a scarlet cascade of his life-giving force. And then he stopped. Turned to face her. This is what this place does to me. Celine stepped closer, put her hands on his cheeks, and locked her gaze with his. Why? Before I tell you, there is more. The scars on his back, the blood that appeared, she would have thought that would have been enough. More than enough. But there was more. His eyes were tortured. Watch. He turned away and began to walk, reaching a creek a few yards away. She followed and stood on the bank as he walked in, turned his back to her, and tossed water over his shoulders. The blood washed away, leaving in its place fresh lacerations. No longer scars. How did those get there? Still facing away from her, he looked at Celine over his shoulder. Not yet. Keep watching. And again another surprise for her, as the lacerations began to seal, closing over themselves as if someone were fast-forwarding time. Now they were white scars. He faced her, his arms low but opened wide, as if making a presentation. Standing next to a tree, Celine reached for it, anything to keep her weak legs from failing. That is. What did one say to this? Horrifying. Amazing. Confusing. There's more. I have to show you how I am able to heal so quickly. And after, perhaps we can talk about the scars. The whys of this did not matter. This was the man she loved. She wanted no other man, had never wanted another man or known one like Étienne. Their souls were bound. Celine stepped away from the tree and into the water. She wrapped her arms around his waist and raised her hands, her fingertips grazing the raised scars on his back. He flinched. My scars. They are not new. They were. It was a long time ago. Ages ago. Celine surveyed his face. That's impossible. Some would say seeing ghosts is impossible. Then how do you? How are you? You don't look like you're that old. I was killed by a vampire. Or almost killed. A witch cast a spell that kept me from dying, but it changed me. Changed you how? Étienne studied her eyes. The time was now. The test had come. He'd give his tiger the reins, but not for a full shift. Give me your hand. She held it out. Étienne took her hand, then closed his eyes, praying his tiger wouldn't push too hard. A searing sensation in his gums, then the lengthening of bone matter, signaled his canines had come in. Opening his eyes, he placed her index finger on his bottom lip, kissed it, and said another prayer. Celine's finger rested on Étienne's bottom lip. His eyes opened. She gasped. There was a rippling silver flame coursing through the light brown of his eyes. Your eyes, she whispered. He gripped her finger tighter and parted his lips, then rubbed her finger against his teeth. She jerked her hand back. Oh God, you're... No, you can't be. You go out in the daytime. Vampires only come out at night. She shook her head as if to clear it. What are you? Keep watching. Étienne's voice was almost a growl. He held out his arm, giving his tiger more leeway. His skin began to undulate, rippling, black and white stripes forming beneath the surface. You're... She pursed her lips, eyes wide. No. I'm too confused. I'm seeing things. Do you want to see me in my full form? Étienne barely managed to get the words out, his voice distorted by the tiger's presence. She nodded. Trust me. God, he was losing his voice. His tiger was overtaking him. With my life. That was the key that gave him the permission he needed. Within seconds, and with very little sound except a slight creak and a crunch, Étienne's tiger was in his skin. Étienne kept his eyes downcast. He didn't want to see the horror in hers. He'd do nothing if she meant to leave him. He'd do nothing at all.
Chapter 22. Celine didn't move. She wasn't sure she could move if she'd wanted to. Right there next to her in touching distance, a white tiger stood before her, more magnificent than any being she'd ever seen. The tiger's gaze was cast down, his eyes focused on the ground between them. This was the man she loved. This was how he conquered death, with the help of a witch. This was her Étienne. More than anything, he was her man. She needed no ring to make that be, it simply was. As sure as the sun was above and the moon would follow, this was the man for her. Who else would she have, a woman who saw ghosts? A bubbling laugh of joy rose in her throat, but before she could release it, she noticed Étienne's tiger still was not looking at her. She bent low, kneeling to gaze into his tiger's eyes, now a dark blue color. She leaned in, breathing the same air the tiger was breathing. She wrapped her arms around him, his fur thick and luxurious, his muscles rippling beneath her fingertips. And still, though she'd stared in his eyes, he refused to raise his. Étienne. Her voice was not much more than a whisper, carried on the breeze, nearly eclipsed by the creek's gurgling. He huffed, a gentle sound that released a puff of warm air, striking her on the cheek. We are together. Forever. There will be no others. Can you turn back to yourself so we can talk? The tiger made a chuffing sound, and before her very eyes once more the man she loved appeared. Later she would dwell on the sounds and the visions of his morphing from one form to another, but all she could do now was drink in the sight of him. You are not bothered by the tiger? His voice was hoarse. No. He is. He is you. Tell me about the scars. She touched his shoulder, saddened when he flinched. Sorry. I did not mean to hurt you. No, it is not your fault. You didn't hurt me. No one sees those. No one touches those. Tell me about them, she said, though in her heart she knew what she would hear, and hearing it would break her heart just as thinking it did. And so Étienne told her of the cruel overseer, of his grandmother's death, of the vampire and the witch's saving spell, and that he'd lived in the north for a long time. He had more to tell, but he paused, drained. The place you lived? When you were not free. Her voice was filled with emotion and hollow with pain. Arceneaux plantation. A tear had made its way from the cage of her lashes and went its way down her cheek. And? She paused, rubbing her temple, chewing on her bottom lip. And your father? Your mother? If your grandmother raised you, what happened to them? My mother died in childbirth. Giving birth to you? He nodded. Her name? Now she chewed on her finger. Olivia. Olivia Duchesne, Celine said. How could you possibly know that? When I was cleaning out my father's paperwork, I found his journal. I saw it once from long ago. He was younger than I am now. He was in love with a woman called Olivia Duchesne. Then she was gone from his life. He wrote that he never loved another woman like that. She froze, her eyes wide. But you? No. You can't. You can't be his son. You're too young. He. Vigorous head shaking. No. It can't be. Étienne took her hands. It is. So your grandmother's name was not Amelia? No, it was Marguerite, the stone at the grave where I was the first time you met me. Father never knew about you. Étienne shook his head. Oh, the heartbreak. The heartbreak of those lives. Celine burst into tears. No, love. Do not cry. Do not be troubled. Those times are past. Philip and my mother. He exhaled deeply. They lived the lives they lived based on. Another exhale. I cannot carry my anger forever. I have to find goodness. I found goodness. He kissed her temple, his lips brushing the soft hairs, his nose taking in the scent of this woman, his tiger relishing her essence as he breathed it in. I found you. I never imagined anything could be like this. Never. It can be so much more if you'll be mine. I already am. Her eyes glistened, her tongue ran the course of her bottom lip. Ah, woman. You know not what you do to me. I'd like to know. All of it. Everything. Étienne did not need more of an invitation. Chapter 23. Étienne's breath was warm on Celine's neck. A shiver washed over her. Her body on fire for him, she ached for his touch, and a yearning gathered somewhere south. Her need for him was fierce. He awoke a part of her that needed to be taken and claimed by him. She could no sooner deny herself the pleasure of Étienne than she could her own breaths. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. His lips dove in, taking hers, conquering, claiming. She pressed against the muscled length of his body, drew her fingertips across the scars, traced them lightly. His need for her pressed between them, a demanding, pulsing reminder. Celine wrapped her arms around his neck, her knees weak and her body quivering. He slipped one hand under her top, his fingers hot on her flesh, searing with their touch. Her nipples were tight with hunger for his touch. When his fingers brushed over the hard peaks, Celine gasped and closed her eyes. He pulled her top over her head. She stood topless, quaking with desire, her breasts with taut nipples eager for him. Étienne struck quickly, taking a nipple into his mouth, drawing it in. The sensation sent her to a place she'd never been before. A moan sounded, and it took her a second to realize it was her own. With a hand on one breast and his mouth on another, he tortured and delighted her, making her body react. Head thrown back, back arched, Celine held on to his shoulders, fearing her legs would turn to mush. One of Étienne's hands drifted ever lower, seeking fingers scorching her stomach, pausing at her waistband. Celine's breaths came out in pants while he slid her garments down. Étienne swallowed, with difficulty. Before him she stood, a veritable Titian-haired goddess. No woman had ever gotten such a reaction from him, or his tiger. He breathed in, taking her scent of excitement deeply into his lungs. He slid a hand down her body and cupped her mound, breathing deeply again. I want you. He managed to struggle the words out, watching her face for any signs of distress. He was being forward, but then again he wasn't. In his heart and mind and in his tiger's, she was already theirs. Take me. God, make me yours. Please. Her voice was husky with yearning, matching the scent of her. Her eyelids were heavy with desire. Étienne's fingers slid between her slick folds, the goal, her already swollen center, he rubbed in fast circles. She writhed in his arms, nails digging into his arms, scoring the flesh, fueling his hunger. Her movements spurred his fingers to rubbing her faster and faster while she moved, pulling him closer with her grip on his arms. She whimpered, a low carnal sound that began to build toward a peak, until she screamed and hung on to him, her body giving in to the release. Étienne. His name was one long moan as it left her lips. He dove in, claiming her mouth, his tongue twirling over hers, then dominant in the same way he wanted to claim all of her. Her legs trembled as she watched him remove his pants with one hand and sit on a log, bringing her onto his lap in an embrace. Bodies lined up just so, as if meant to be, his hardness found her moist entrance. With abandon, no control whatsoever, yielding to the hurricane force of passion that raged within him, Étienne pulled her down, harder than he'd planned, his length filling her, stretching her but not all the way in. A loud gasp escaped her as she took all of him. As if this was not their first time, so well positioned and matched they were, she fit on him as if molded to him. Étienne moved his hips and she ground down, so deep he groaned. He was filled with the power of their desire. Heat traveled through his body, energy through his veins. He groaned when she rocked her hips, fighting the urge to release. He was in her full hilt, the sounds of her passion pushing him closer and closer to the edge. She thrust backward, her breasts arched up, her muscles tight around him. Étienne leaned in, taking her nipple in his mouth, sucking on the stiff peak, relishing the way it pebbled further in his mouth. Celine. Ah, woman. He needed her. He wanted her. He craved her. All of her. His tiger released a snarl in agreement. Years of emotions escaped Étienne as he opened his mouth and let his tiger's sentiments come out in a roar. Celine leaned forward, drinking in the sound, taking in his pain and hope, making it her own. Her complete melding to him was his undoing, and pulling back with a grunt, he thrust deeply into her, filling her. Her outcry matched his own. She gave as good as she got as she grabbed his shoulders and pulled herself in, taking even more of him. His tiger growled deeply within Étienne. The growling persisted until Étienne finally understood what the tiger was trying to communicate. He wanted Étienne to mark her as theirs. To bond with her, to couple bond, giving her a longer life, keeping them together. The sacred bond no man or shifter could render asunder. She has to want it, he reminded his tiger. The tiger snarled. Are you mine? He asked Celine. Are you truly, forever mine? Those were his tiger's words, but he felt them as well, just the same. He thrust with every word, she thrust back, meeting his ferocity with as much passion as he had. Forever, Étienne. Forever, she cried out as her body began to yield to the climax. He felt his tiger pushing on him. Not desiring to shift, but to bond with her. The tiger insisted, pushing Étienne closer to coming undone. That would be the moment to bond, when they met at the pinnacle of their climax. When another of Celine's moans filled the wooded area, matching the one when she'd climaxed earlier, Étienne picked up speed, sliding into her over and over, pounding against her body, yelling her name. He leaned in, his mouth on the soft flesh where her shoulder met her neck, and dug his canines in while his essence released deeply within her body, melding with her orgasm. Celine rested softly in Étienne's arms, their passions sated, their hearts beating as one. She glanced up at the man she'd give her life for. That moment when you bit me, that was? A bond was formed, a couple bond. We are mated, forever. She sighed, leaned into his chest, her breath warm against his flesh. Perfect.
Epilogue. A few months later. Étienne had moved into Arceneaux plantation, had shifted his business interests south, and lived with the woman he loved on the property he'd come to love. He sat on the veranda, enjoying a leisurely weekend breakfast with his mate. I have something to show you, Celine took his hand. Where are we going? Hush, no questions. Just come. Celine led him down the path, past the cabins, making a beeline for the cemetery. Étienne saw it, long before they came upon it. A glowing beautiful pink marble stone, dark maroon veins coursing through the pink hues, placed at the head of Nana's grave. Ah, Celine. You did not. But clearly you did. He was overwhelmed by emotion. Words cannot express. She squeezed his hand. What's the second stone about? He gestured toward another stone, matching his grandmother's. Your mother. Really? That's where she is. I always wondered. Nana never said. I found some papers in the attic. It seems after your grandmother died, they put her possessions in a trunk. Somehow, it ended up in the attic. And the papers confirmed what I knew. My father may have loved my mother. I don't feel I have any reason to doubt that, but your mother was the love of his life. He never forgot her. And your grandmother knew that. She also feared for both of them, so she kept Olivia's grave a secret and let Philip leave brokenhearted. For some reason, that gave Étienne a measure of comfort, though he knew if he were asked to explain it, there'd be no way he could. Étienne lengthened his strides, eager to see the stones up close. There, next to Nana's marker, the matching one. Olivia, daughter of Marguerite, loved by Philip. I left space to add, mother to Étienne. She studied his face. If you'd ever like to. He couldn't speak. Celine was the mate for him. He and his tiger had done well. She was more than his mate. She was his soulmate. Thank you, he said, barely managing to get the words out, choked with emotion. He felt the moisture on his back, knew it wasn't sweat, knew it had begun as they'd walked near the cabins. He knelt at the feet of his mother's and grandmother's graves. Thank you, Celine. Thank you for the tribute to these two remarkable women. One woman who gave birth to him, the other the woman who raised him. I have more plans for the cemetery. I have bids for upgrading, putting an ornate fence around it, some landscaping. Celine, he kept his tone gentle. I want it to stay as is. She quirked a brow. Truly. I can't explain it. I need it to stay the way it is, the way I remember it. Except for the markers. She nodded. I can appreciate that. I really can. I told Claudette we'd take her to lunch, but before we go, there's something I want to talk to you about. Concern flickered in her eyes. We have to leave the plantation permanently. We cannot stay, Celine whispered. We cannot leave. This is your home. I will not choose my home over you. Why do you have to make a choice? She touched his shoulder gently. You're back. The blood. I'm not leaving. This is our home. Then you have to let me get you help. Who can help with this? But as soon as the question left his lips, he knew the answer. You want to take me to see Latrice? She can help. Why do I get the feeling you've already talked to her? Celine nodded. We spoke. In that case, there is something you should know. There was no way he could keep the truth from her. She was his mate. She was his tiger's mate. He told her about Lucia. Your past is your past. It's who you are and what made you the man I love. Perhaps one day I can meet Lucia. She is a remarkable woman, he said, wishing he knew more about Lucia, wishing he could simply reach out and have her meet his mate, be a part of his life, let her be a part of his. Celine accepted Lucia, being his daughter, better than he'd thought. She took his hand. Any other secrets I should know about? None. None that would ever threaten the love I have for you. I have one for you. Lucia is not the only child you know, Celine said. So that's what I was hearing. Étienne cocked his head. A second heartbeat. A baby. He wrapped his arms around her waist and swung her in a circle, laughing. We will create a new Arceneaux dynasty. One that will outshine the tarnish of the past. Celine laughed. I'm getting dizzy, Étienne. Slow down. In his head, his tiger roared with happiness. The next day, Celine sent for Latrice, who met them at the cabins. Latrice turned to Étienne, her expression unreadable. I can make you forget everything. I do not want to forget everything. There is nothing served from forgetting the evil that men do. I want to always remember, but I have to find a way to live with it. The bleeding, Celine added, it has to stop. I can do that. Latrice stooped to pick up some dirt, then walked to the nearest cabin and pulled bark off the outside wall. Come check tomorrow. See if you are free of this. And just like that, without another word, she was gone. The next morning at daybreak, Celine's lips pressed against Étienne's, waking him. Woman, did you not get enough of me last night? He teased. A slow-growing blush kissed her cheeks. Let's test your back. Now. He knew already he would pass. He could sense it in his tiger, but he humored his mate, dressed, and led the way to the cabins. Étienne strode up to the structures, never missing a beat, Celine behind him, while he just kept on marching, secure in the knowledge Latrice's spell had worked. He had felt it work when his tiger had finally been at peace. He kept walking until he'd entered his grandmother's cabin, the remnants of the vampire long ago cleaned up. It was Nana's place again. He turned around and around, then raised his shirt over his head. Any blood? Celine kissed the long scars that had healed and never reopened. Not a bit. She traced each one lovingly. Will they ever disappear? They never have before, but perhaps now, maybe. Do you want them to? He took her hands in his. Tell me the truth. No. They are you. Do you want them to disappear? He'd not thought of that. The only thing he gave thought to these days was life with Celine. Not sure. What will you tell our child? What would you have me tell him? Him. She smiled. Wishful thinking. Hardly. I can differentiate the heartbeats. Tell him the truth. It is said it shall set you free. Étienne lowered his lips to hers. You have set my spirit free. And you mine. She raised onto her toes and sealed the covenant of their love.
Thank you for listening. This has been a Shifters Forever Worlds book by L. Thorne. Stay tuned for more episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell to be notified of new releases.